for changes to be made. There's room for other influences and other interventions that can change that. So it's not an absolute statement, but generally speaking, persons who come from a healthy relationship, family relationship, are able to build healthy relationships with others. As we grow, of course, the importance of our relationships change. So as a child, the most important relationship we would say would be the relationship with our family. As we become older, maybe at adolescent stage, we kind of move away from that important relationship, not move out of it, but we tend to want to gravitate towards our friends more so than our family members. Of course, again, this is not an absolute statement. There are variations. And in some cases, some adolescents or some teenagers don't even want to be seen in public with their parents because they figure, I've passed that stage, maybe my parents would embarrass me or whatever. But they will tend to gravitate more to their friends, and sometimes they go to their friends for advice, which may not always be the best thing because their friends may be just as limited in their knowledge as they themselves. But sometimes that's what we do because we figure them parents or them, they know what's going on. I talk with my friends so that they can tell me how to deal with any matter. Now, when we consider the stages of development, we get to the point where we start to question what we would have grown accustomed to or what our parents may have taught us. And we then wonder, is this something that I want to maintain? Are these the values that I want to maintain? Is this a course of life that I want to maintain? And sometimes we choose maybe to take a different course. But generally speaking, that is the general course of development that we would undertake. But of course, as parents, don't be fooled, our adolescents still need our guidance. Sometimes when parents observe that their children are kind of leaning more towards their friends, they figure that, okay, this is the stage that they can run their course. But adolescents still need to have that guidance, and even though they may appear to reject it, it is still the responsibility that we have been tasked with as parents to provide boundaries, to provide direction, to provide rules and guidelines for our children to follow. Okay, as we pass that stage of adolescence and we move into adulthood, sometimes we then value the wisdom of going to our parents and maybe asking their advice on something. And we reach a point where we ourselves as young adults want our parents to approve us, want our parents to be pleased with what we do. Another dynamic then that we encounter is when we go off to work or when we go off to further study, sometimes in terms of moving out of the home and maybe setting up somewhere on our own. We also have to battle our foreign relationships with others. Then we get into the stage of male-female relationships. When we get into more serious relationships, we get into marriage. So all of those are different relationships that in our lifetime we would develop, and as we develop, the dynamics change. But the truth remains that our very existence depends on the quality of the relationships that we have. Do you agree with that? Okay, some people do. So our very existence depends on the quality of the relationships that we have. And there's an old saying, no man is an island, which speaks to the fact that we depend on each other. We need each other. And sometimes even though we become individualistic and we become privatized, so to speak, we still strive or we still have to rely on others, and we still need each other. And when we reach the point where we can return to that understanding, then we are in a much better place. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that that's the way how God has created us. God has created us as social beings to interact with others, and we cannot exist then on our own. But when our relationships don't work, or when they're challenged in some way, we have problems. And sometimes those problems may be seen in our homes. If we have a challenge with our home relationships, sometimes the effects can be seen in our work relationships. I remember at school, we would often assume that a particular teacher who came in miserable and fretting may have had an argument at home before they came to school that morning. So sometimes our relationships and the challenges in one set of relationships may spill over into another one, and vice versa. So our home can sometimes affect our work relationships and so on. But our relationships, therefore, need work if we are going to maintain them and if we are going to sustain them. What is also true that in life we cannot just move along. We have to assess the relationships and evaluate the relationships that we are involved in. Sometimes we might find a relationship is working well. Sometimes it may not be working well. What then do we do? Sometimes we encounter persons who are motivated by selfishness, by greed, by personal gain. And they are sometimes the persons who are in our space who build relationships with us, but are they really the type of relationships that we want to have? What then do we do? Now, I want you to tell me, what are some of the qualities that we expect to see in a healthy relationship? What are some of the things that we want to have? This is your time that you can speak. What are some of the qualities that you would want, that we want to have in a healthy relationship? Pardon? Caring and sharing. You were saying something as well? Good communication. Love, respect, I heard over here. Anything else?
Trust.
Trust. Give me two more. Pardon? Honesty. Yes, we would want honesty. Pardon?
Understanding.
Understanding.
Love.
Okay, somebody up here has said love as well. So we want to see all of these qualities in our relationships. We want to be able to trust that person that we call our friend. We want to know that that person is supportive of us, that there's mutual respect, that that person sees us as an equal and treats us as an equal, treats us with that level of respect. We also would want within our relationships, not only friendships, we also want to know that there are healthy boundaries. Persons know where to stop, where to go. There's also forgiveness. And something that I always remember saying, well, when I was in the secondary school setting, was say to students, if you are looking at this person or another person and calling that person a friend, if that person sees you going down the wrong path and they do not do anything about it or say anything to you, that person is not really your friend. Because that friend should be able to encourage the best out of you and support that development of the best in you and be able to build you up rather than pull you down. So if you are in a relationship with someone who does not do that, then you have to really consider whether that person is really your friend. So if we are thinking that relationships, then we talked about healthy relationships. If we're thinking then that our relationship can be toxic, then those characteristics are lacking. And when we think of toxic, what do you think of? Poisons, something that is harmful or can potentially cause your demise or cause your death. So if we're thinking then of toxic relationships, we're thinking of relationships that lack most of those or all of those characteristics and that cause some level of discomfort to you. Let me share a definition with you. One writer says that a toxic relationship is any relationship between people who don't support each other, where there's conflict and one seeks to undermine the other, where there's competition, where there's disrespect, and a lack of cohesiveness. Now, sometimes when we think of toxic relationships, we think of maybe an abusive type of relationship. That may be the first thing we think of. But it may not necessarily be abuse that is physical. It could also be an emotional type of abuse where persons are not able to be themselves. Our relationships sometimes go through ups and downs, but a toxic relationship is consistently unpleasant and draining for the people in it, to the point that the negative moments outnumber the positive ones. There are sometimes mentally, emotionally, and possibly even physically damaging to one or both participants. Now, sometimes it's hard to tell that a relationship is toxic. Sometimes it may be easy, but sometimes it is not so easy to tell. And sometimes we have to rely on maybe those who love us, our friends and our family, to tell us or to help us to see that the relationship that we are in is not a healthy one. And sometimes that may not always go down well, because if you are in a relationship with someone, you figure that you love this person, and somebody tells you that maybe this is not the best person for you. Sometimes that forces you closer to the person than actually causing you to consider if this is the best person for you. But as young people, you have to have your eyes open. You cannot then jump into a relationship and figure that it will work all the time or it will be the best for you. And you have to be open to the input of persons or the insight of persons who love you. There may be persons who will attempt to tell you things who may not necessarily care. They may have an ulterior motive in mind. But if you have persons who really care and love you, you can take what they say to heart and allow it then to help you to make your choices well. So how can you tell then that a relationship is toxic? If you are spending time with someone who drags you down, who belittles you, who makes you feel hurt, angry, and miserable. And the underlying thing about a toxic relationship is a level of insecurity for the person who is bringing the toxicity to the relationship. And it might be that those persons are controllers or dependents. Now, when you think of controllers, you think of relationship, the first word that might come to your head is a bossy person. But it may not necessarily be bossy in a way, but they're controlling. So they want to ensure that they are in charge of everything, every decision that has to be made, every move that you have to make. If it is that they want to pursue a particular path, you must fall in line and you must do what it is that they say must be done. They make the decisions. They blame others and deny their own personal problems. Everything is somebody else's fault. They're right about everything, and sometimes they take the other person for granted. They're the one who takes all the time. They control the conversation. They control the activities. And those persons, sometimes when an individual gets into a relationship like that, they're kind of are isolated from their friends or isolated from their family members, because now this particular person has taken over, so to speak, and is consuming them. So it can be draining on that person to the extent that they may risk losing themselves, losing their own identity. And sometimes such relationships can become abusive because the person cannot see or understand why you can't follow my way. And sometimes it might be a personality thing. It might be that God is still working on them. But the fact is that it makes for a difficult relationship with that person. Or, as I said, it can be a dependent. Now, a dependent, if you want to say, is kind of opposite to the controller. The dependent also has some measure of insecurity, but they are now weak, and they feel as though I am not worth anything. I am not worth any respect. I'm not worth any appreciation. I'm not a valuable person, so whatever you do with me is good. I will take whatever you give. And they allow others to then control them. They are often persons who don't think highly of themselves. They have a low self-esteem. And they constantly worry then about making the other person happy. So they go out of their way to ensure that that person who is the controller in their life is happy. They do what they want them to do. And if something happens, it is my fault. I have done the wrong thing, and I have caused this particular thing to happen, without recognizing that the problem may stem from an external source. So, some other things, some other characteristics of a toxic person: they're possessive, and I think this will come out in the same thing I've just said, and jealous. They don't want you to be involved with anybody else. They want to check your phones, make sure that who you're talking to, and so on and so forth. You know, with that, that's a new dynamic. They put down others. They lack a sense of give and take. They, as I said, they sometimes can become abusive, and they keep you from experiencing the best of what life has to offer. So, I'm sure if you think, you may even think that you might be in a toxic relationship, or that you know some person who is in a toxic relationship. And the question is, what then should you do? Some people, and I want to put it here, some people recognize that there's a challenge with their relationship, and they remain. And we sometimes, if you're looking from outside and looking in, you wonder, why does that person remain in this? In some cases, they may not feel as though they have a choice. In some cases, they may not be the working partner, and they depend on the other person for support. In some cases, they don't feel as though they have what it takes to get up and do something different. So they get accustomed to that particular relationship, and they stay. As I said, sometimes if it is a person who is a dependent, they may feel as though they have to be controlled, or they have to exist in that type of a relationship. In some cases, if it is in a working environment, it may not be that easy to pick up and decide to move on, because that's the way you make your livelihood. So we sometimes might figure, oh, the solution is get up and move. You don't have to stay with it. But it is not always that simple to get up and move. So then the question is, what do you do? Especially if you're in a relationship and you find that you're experiencing depression, you're experiencing anxiety, you're less of yourself, and you're not able to pursue what you think is best for you. Then what do you do? Now, I would say, first of all, and I was, something that I found interesting that I was reading, where an individual said that as Christians, sometimes, at least that was her opinion, that we are placed in relationships, and sometimes those relationships are not the best always, but, or even if they're the best, we are placed in a relationship, and God is using that relationship to help us to grow and to develop. And it was her opinion then that you should then work on the relationship. Now, I'm going to take that as my first point of departure. If you're in that type of relationship, first of all, you recognizing that you have a challenge, confront the person, talk about it, and express your concerns. If that may or may not work, but if it doesn't, you need to seek help. If, for instance, the relationship is physically abusive, then that's a no-no. You can't stay within a physically abusive relationship. It may require you to step aside for the sake of working on the issue or working on the problem. And it's not to separate for eternity. It is to separate to deal with the problem, because invariably the controller and the dependent, both persons, have a problem. And therefore they need help. And if it sometimes requires you to move aside for a bit while you seek help, that might be the route that you should take. So you seek help. And other help may require you to seek professional counseling. And in this case, in that setting, then you're looking at trying to unearth some of those reasons or some of those why you would have learned that pattern of behavior, because all of it stems from your thoughts lead to your behavior, and sometimes your experiences lead you to that type of behavior. So within that sessions, or those number of sessions, you will have to look back to see, where did I learn this, and how then can I unlearn it or learn other behaviors that might be more conducive to building healthy relationships. So seek help. And as I said, if it is abusive, you can't remain just there all the time. Sometimes too, we have to look at ourselves and look to see how we can better ourselves. We can't change the other person. We can't make them do what we want them to do. So we look at ourselves and ask God to help us to grow and help us to be the type of person he will want us to be, and to help to develop and to form the relationship as the relationship that he wants us to have. And finally, what I would want to say, at every stage of our lives, we need to examine our relationships. We as Christians know that God is our ultimate standard, relationship standard. He is the example, and we ought to learn from him. And I would want to say, and I remember saying this at Holders sometime, sometimes as young people, we tend to want to abandon our childhood too soon. And we want to align ourselves into serious relationships. Sometimes if we pace ourselves and take time to really understand who we are, first of all, because there's some self-discovery that we would need to have in order to build good relationships. Know who we are, know who God wants us to be. Then get to know people generally. Get to know, you don't have to specialize on one particular and say this person is my boyfriend or this is my girlfriend. Generalize. Get to know people. Get to know how different people handle different situations. And then when it comes to the time when you want to settle down and choose someone, then you would know, at least from what you would have experienced, the things that you would want to avoid. And if we pace ourselves and don't be too hurried to get into relationships, then the possibilities of building a more healthy relationship would exist. Because when we jump into relationships and we are not ourselves mature enough to handle it, then sometimes these types of things can happen. So learn from God how he would want us to be. He's our ultimate example, our ultimate standard. And if we find that our relationships are lacking in some way or are less than what he desires, let us be intentional in doing something about it until we reach the point that God would approve. And that's my presentation for this afternoon. I don't know if we're taking questions at this point. Any questions? Okay, that sounds like no. Any questions?
Yeah, as I was saying, in your first paragraph, you give out the signs to look for in a toxic relationship. Are all these signs sometimes visible? And then you went into the second paragraph where you might say someone was probably in the relationship, and depending on one person that's working, and then and not so depending on that person not realizing that they're really in a toxic relationship. So I just want to know, are all these signs visible to the eye, or sometimes they might not be visible, or there might be other signs that you can look for, or something like that?
Okay, what I would say is sometimes people are in a relationship and they cannot recognize or they don't recognize that there's a problem or that it is of this nature as a toxic relationship. They may have been living with it until somewhere along the line they become enlightened and they recognize they're able to step back from it, as it were, and recognize these things that they would have been experiencing that they may have, in some cases, played down. In some cases, they may be blatant, and some cases they are subtle. So it may not always be something that you would see. Let's say, for instance, sometimes people talk about being involved in an abusive relationship, and especially as a married person, and people always say, you should have known or you should have seen signs before so that you know whether to get involved or not. But it is not always that evident. It's not always that clear to see. And sometimes, as funny as it would sound, when you are courting some person, you try to put out your best. You don't always show your true colors. And sometimes when you then are involved, when you move on then and you are married, you're actually living with the person day in, day out. Then you get to see a lot of things that you may not necessarily have seen before. So it's not always evident. It is not always, and I don't think people always realize. I have a friend right now who is battling with a relationship, and she would have been married for years. But now, at this stage, she is recognizing a lot of the things, a lot of these signs, a lot of these things, and she's now are that you don't know.
Well, you would say then, if I was in an abusive relationship, to come out of that. But suppose I was in a relationship, probably not abusive, but all of them are abusive in a way, if you look at them. But in a way that, let's say my wife might be holding back something from me, or I holding back something from her, whatever the case. Should we, as a Christian, walk away from the relationship or try to work on it? And if we work on it and it works, and let me say we're going on 3 years and it worked good, and then going into the fourth, it might pop up an ugly head again. Should we then give it 2 times, 2 chances or 3 chances, or should we walk away one time from it?
You're asking me a hard question. The Bible says that God hates divorce. So I'm going to start on that premise. In any event, you need to work on it. Relationships call for work. They don't happen by magic. And as much as we would like things to work, we have to work on them. And we have to be intentional about working on it. And that's quite easy to say anyway, but it's a little harder to actually do it, to actually work on it. But we have to be intentional about working on our relationship. I can't tell you how many times you're going to try, but I'm sure if you were to listen to persons who were married for eons, decades, they would tell you, yes, there are challenges. They ain't going to lie to you. They'll tell you there are challenges, but because your foundation is that you love this person, you want to please God, first and foremost, you want to please your partner, then you work on it. And as many times as it requires, you work on it. But as I said, if it is physically abusive, then it might require you to move apart so that you can actually work on what is causing it, to fix it, and then put it back together.
And there's expert help, all right, in certain areas, whether it's battering or the other part we say withholding, there's expert help. Now, my question, I came late, so I don't know if you talked about this. to ask, is there an impact on relationships, especially among young people, social media impact? And why I asked that question, I remember once we had a retreat and we were at a hotel and there was this couple and they were married, they were very young, you could see. But from they came to the table, both of them were on their things and not a word being exchanged. And that was for the whole morning until they ate their breakfast and they get up and they came back for lunch. We saw them dinner, the same thing. So I just wanted to know. Yeah? That's your thing.
That might be a different challenge. That might be a different challenge. Speaking now in terms of communication, that's a different ball game altogether. But this is the new age that we're living in. But
when you ask about what denotes a healthy relation, tell some things, and I mean communication was one of them. So that's why I asked that.
Okay. I'm not so sure if there is a question. I would take it as a statement, as a comment. So, but communication is critical. You have to communicate within a relationship. I sometimes am faulty on that, but we have to communicate well within a relationship so that the partner doesn't have to guess what we're thinking or what we're feeling, but so that they know and can then respond accordingly. But I would want to say, though, before Robert speaks, that as a church, we need to be supportive of each other. Sometimes, because of the structure of the church, a lot of times we come together for services like this. We don't often have social gatherings. Some churches are able to create like a support group, maybe in family life and so on. But we have to be intentional as a church to meet the social needs of our members. We have to be able not only to, and I know the Bible is critical, our doctrines are critical, but we also have to learn to care for each other. And if we see persons who have a challenge, quite often we get in our corners and we talk about them rather than trying to help. And helping may not necessarily mean you're going to get anybody business, because that may not be helpful. But we have to be a little more caring as a church family. Yes?
So this is continuing from Dale's comments, Dale's question. There's such a thing as verbal abuse, as you know. So all abuse isn't physical, it can be verbal abuse. It can be in a relationship where you're verbally abused. There's also psychological abuse. A person really making you feel, putting you down all the time. Now, there's verbal abuse, there's psychological abuse. Is there such a thing as silent abuse? Or maybe you can talk about all three. But I would like to know if there's such a thing as silent abuse, where the person is, as you said just now, the person should really communicate with you and let you know their feelings, and you shouldn't have to guess what it is they're thinking or whatever they can. But is there such a thing as silent abuse, and how do you deal with that in a relationship?
Well, I figured that might be a type of emotional abuse as well, where you are, I think it's a type of emotional abuse. I think so. How do you manage silence?
Getting silent treatment may also need counseling or something. How do you manage that?
Well, I think the strategy I was talking about in terms of dealing with a toxic relationship is something that can be used here, where the parties involved confront the other, talk about it, and if that does not work in terms of bringing a resolution to this situation, you seek help from a third party, some person who can help, and not necessarily someone who will just talk about it, but some person who can actually help you dig down and see where the challenge may have originated and see how you can then undo that behavior. Yes, sure.
Good evening. Okay, so prayer. A few years ago, that movie came out, Prayer Room, something. War Room. Oh, yeah, right. And it was more so pushed in terms of for the females, whether it is from a daughter to mother to sister to aunt to wife, girlfriend. And the expectation was, instead of talk, kind of a silent treatment where you're just praying about it. You're not getting into the argument, you're not being confrontational anymore, which technically means for women we're being silent because we're just praying about it. How it is effective, so I'm not going to ask how effective it is, but should that not be as females, I'm talking as a woman, I'm not discounting men, they can pray too, but should that be our go-to? First, foremost, and maybe even the go-to to get over the challenges on all levels that we are facing within our various relationships. Just praying about it.
I think I would have mentioned that in the presentation, whereas we need to sometimes work on ourselves and all, with God working on us to make us the kind of partner that we ought to be. And yes, we also have to pray for our partners, but from the standpoint that we cannot change who they are. And I think sometimes that's the mistake that we start with. We want them to be who we want them to be. But we can't change persons. But we have to then be able to submit to God and allow him to make us the kind of partner we ought to be, and then to make the change on the other person. So yes, it's a go-to. And sometimes I still see the value though if you're not making headway. And I don't want to say we're not making headway because God works in his time. But if things are getting to the point where you're not making progress, there's still value in including a third person. But sometimes I think, yes, we should begin with prayer.
Good evening. I like the point you made about the church being helpful. Now, I'm totally in agreement with that. But how can we get the church to be helpful? If, let's say the men. Now, if I have a problem in my home, who do I go to? The pastor? Do I go to, the elders who may not be trained in psychology, who may not understand how I'm dealing with things? Now, the reason I ask this is because many times you have male friends, and you are expected to have your home ordered godly, correct. But when things don't go the way you want them to go, and you're home, and you're challenged, and your wife is beating you, you understand what I'm saying? And things are tight, and everybody expects you to come to church on Sabbath with a smile in your face, and everything is going well and happy. How do we get the church and the people to be caring, to be compassionate, to be understanding, to know that we are human beings and that people do suffer? The thing is, I go to church, from church to church. There are a lot of people I'm afraid to ask how their relationship going. I'm afraid because I get some, as an elder, I get some frightening things. So I am of the view that the church should go to the area of concern and care. I know that we have a lot of people who like to preach and teach and do stuff, but there are a lot of hurting people. I can see it, you see it, So I don't know, how can we get the church to be more understanding?
I would say the church is made up of us, and we have to start. If each individual person sees themselves as that caring person and be the type of person we would want to go to, then it will spill over into other persons. Because we often say the church should, and I did say that, but it has to start with each person and each individual person. Sometimes we can't wait on the pastor. I am not knocking Pastor Peters, but we can't wait on the pastor, we can't wait on the elder. The church does have structures though, and I am appalled sometimes that sometimes the men's fellowship can't get going as it ought to. Sometimes the women's ministry tends to outshine the men's fellowship, but that's one of the structures that is in place. But if we can see ourselves as that person and start to make those connections, then I think we can make a difference. And then you might even be able to find someone. Some people might say, well, I ain't going to tell them about my business because I don't know who they're going to tell. But you have to be mindful and you have to be aware of the persons who you're around and be able to know who you can trust if you would want to trust someone in the first place. But each person, let's make it start with us. I was told I had 2 minutes, and I think that was 2 minutes ago. So yes, Sharon. Correct. That's why I was saying the church has the structures, so we need to make the structures work. Yes, please.
Question. Hi, good night. My question is aimed at the church, but I'm going to ask you how you should advise the church, and it's particularly on social media. Usually social media projects a lot of fake ideologies, a lot of fake perceptions, and sometimes young people are roped into these perceptions and thinking that this is how a relationship should be. So I know there is a thing as relationship goals, and people attach certain relationships that are public. Like you have Jay-Z and Beyonce or other celebrities who project a certain happiness, right? And it's always material based. So persons looking at this relationship, he took her on a vacation, bought her a house, a car and stuff, and then now they turn around and expect these things to happen. So how does the church deal with this very, very, very serious situation?
That you're asking me a hard question, but I don't think we can only blame social media. The media generally projects that type of a false reality. And sometimes, yes, I would agree that persons get into relationships expecting that to be their reality, but then they're shocked when they realize that the person that I'm lying down next to actually has bad breath in the morning. You don't see those type of things on movies and stuff like that. But I think if we utilize the facilities within the church, for instance, as Sharon said, it's the family life and the men's fellowship and the women's ministries, and use those avenues to help to point persons to reality. And then too, the couples in the church also have to project the right image too. Sometimes I've heard young people say that they don't see any happy couples in the church, but and it may or may not be true. I ain't saying it is true or it isn't. But we have to be real and project the right thing to our young people. And use the facilities that the church already has, all the offices that we stand up and read on in January. We need to utilize those offices and help our people to develop, because it's not just, as I said, it's not just about doctrine, it's not just about bringing in members, it's also about building up those who are already here. I thank you for your active discussion and your listening, and I trust that as we continue to evaluate and assess our relationships, wherever those relationships fall, that we try to model Christ in those relationships and allow him to lead and direct as he would have us be. Thank you.
All right, let's put our hands together for Ms. Carter, who gave us a very informative discussion and also answered the questions that were fielded to her as well. We really want to thank her for that. Now we're going to go quickly into the final part of the program, which will be opening ceremony, consecration ceremony for the for the tournament tomorrow. But before we get into that, we're just going to sing 2 songs. We're going to ask Pastor Peters to come and help us with that.
We want to, my apologies. We want to stand. Let's do that song. We've been sitting for a while. We're just going to move around, greet each other. Won't you greet somebody in Jesus' name? Won't you tell them that you love them? Just move.